yes, indeed. The year was 1978. The rock music scene was kind of the tail end of Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, and nobody knew what was going to come down. There were bands like REO, Speedwagon, Boston, etc., and then that landed, Eruption, 1978. Perhaps in my honest opinion, the greatest debut album ever released. There's not a bad track on it, and I'll give him a word in a minute, but my next guest has written all about Van Halen on track, every album, every song. Delighted to be joining me live from the line in somewhere on the planet is Morgan Brown. Good afternoon to you, Morgan.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me on the show. Very nice to talk to you.
Pleasure is mine indeed. I remember getting that. In fact, I remember my cousin coming down from Scotland with a home mixtape because he'd bought the album 78 and giving it to me, and me just popping it in the cassette desk and just going, blimey, because the world changed. Basically, the world changed.
Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing really that came before that could have prepared you for the impact of that. It's quite astonishing.
Yeah, and if you think about where the music scene was, it was the tail end of Sabbath and Zeppelin. They were sort of imploding, and Ozzy was in his 8th rehab or something like that. The punk scene had even burnt out by then. Nobody was kind of sure what was going on. There was like AOR and FM, which was REO, Speedwagon, Boston, Journey, etc. And then this lot arrived, and I'm a fan, you may have gathered, but of Van Halen. But over in the UK, we hadn't heard about them, in Europe that much. And in the States, they had been blowing away, like, warm-up bands like Black Sabbath and UFO. And they just, when that album hit, it was absolutely seismic in its effect. Off you go.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. As you say, the old guard of heavy rock were really kind of running out of steam at that point. And I think it's just sort of the incredible musicians coming together at exactly the right time. So they've got the influence of all of those heavy rock bands grow as their teens growing up, but they grew up through the British invasion as well. So they've got Beatles influences, they've got surf music influences, they've got some weird influences like the Van Halen brothers' dad, Jan, brings in a jazz influence, which just crops up occasionally in surprising ways. And all of that kind of comes together with sort of, I guess, a bit of the energy of that LA punk scene, which started a bit later than the UK and New York scenes as well. So I guess that was kind of bubbling away in the underground. I think a lot of those early LA gigs, they were paired with punk bands too.
Yeah, the Southern California, if you think it's all everybody hanging around, humming Beach Boys tracks. I read some stuff about the playing these huge house parties. I mean, in California that would be broken up by the police in a quite, not a please move on. I mean, they were wading in, giving it 10/10 with the batons, whilst the kids were having a great time playing live music.
Yeah, that Pasadena backyard party scene, it sounds absolutely wild. I can't even really imagine coming from the UK when you couldn't fit a band in the backyard, let alone several thousand people.
I'm from Stoke. Yeah. It never happened. It was never going to. The backyard scene in the Potteries was never particularly huge. I can assure you.
No, but it does sound remarkable. I think also, just the location it came from, it couldn't, that band couldn't really have come from anywhere else. It's music designed for parties. It's designed to get people dancing. It's designed for people to have a good time. Heavy rock, before that, maybe not so much. People were getting into these 10-minute songs with lengthy solos and deep, dark themes, and then they've suddenly got this explosion of just party music. It's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, you said at the beginning it was four great musicians getting together. Now, I just want to make one thing, certain on this, Morgan. Dave Lee Roth is not a musician. He's a showman. He goes back to that vaudeville thing. He's a great shouter. He's like, the demon is screaming himself. But he can put on a show. But you wouldn't say, if you had sort of some of the early stuff. I mean, Feel Your Love Tonight. He the whole way through it.
I totally get where you're coming from, and I agree to a point. However, yeah, definitely. I mean, is musically initially the weakest link. I think he failed his first audition, and then managed to wheedle his way into the band by having a PA system that they wanted to rent. But I think he did work really hard, and I think actually there are certainly some tracks which kind of show him to be a bit of a better singer than perhaps some people remember. I mean, he was the first person to be self-deprecating about his own voice. And in his book, he describes his voice as like 4 flat tires on a muddy road. But if you listen to something like Push Comes to Shove from Fair Warning, things like that, Little Dreamer, maybe.
I was about to say that, actually. You got me thinking, but yeah, he's really good on Little Dreamer, because
there's some soul in there. There's I think there's a little bit more than just the showmanship and the shouting. And also, I mean, when you hear his occasional bits of guitar playing, actually a pretty good guitarist.
But I mean, come on, you've got Eddie Van Halen, and let's not. I mean, nobody knew where that. I mean, people said, "Oh yeah, actually, I was doing it, and I found a YouTube concert, 1973, that somebody else was doing it." But nobody liked Eddie, because everybody just.
Oh no.
Yeah, I mean, and having such fun doing it as well. He wasn't moody. He wasn't Tony Iommi. He wasn't gonna slit your throat. There were no dragons or orcs involved. It was just, let's have a great time and look at this solo.
Yeah. Pure joy. Like, every time you see him playing, whatever else is going on in his life, the moment he's playing, he's just got that expression of pure joy in his face, hasn't he? It's incredible. And yeah, as you say, there was, people will always bring up other examples. It's, Steve Hackett was two-handed tapping in the early 70s, but it didn't sound like that. No one had integrated that into their style, and all the different things, the two-handed tapping, there's wild Hendrix stuff with the vibrato bar and the sounds, and then the guitar design as well. It's maybe something that people don't rate him as much for, but he completely changed the way people design guitars.
I just feel really sorry for UFO, because Strangers in the Night was a great album, and there's a gig in 76 or 77, and they have Van Halen as a warm-up in California, and they just, Pete Way just goes, I'm not going, I just don't want to go on now, because obviously Southern California, local band, Eddie blowing them away, because also Michael Anthony and the other Halen, brilliant brilliant engine room, bass playing, drumming, absolutely superb. So when they hit the studio, it was basically, and I'm not telling you about your book, but it was basically the complete item, and that's why not a bad song on the track on the album, in my opinion.
That's it. You're absolutely right. They arrived because it'd been quite a slow gestation period from the kind of covers band through all the originals, and they'd worked on those demos and everything. They were completely fully formed by the time that first album. If you hear the demo that they made when they signed with Warner's as well, you can hear how ready they were. They kind of blasted through their entire repertoire in 2 hours, and they're astonishing performances.
The other thing is the fact, and this goes all the way through Van Halen, especially the early albums, is the humour. I mean, we talked about that whole thing about them being happy, but there are knowing winks to the audience. Things like Ice Cream Man on the first album, and all the way through Hot for Teacher. It's like Dave is your best mate who's saying, "Hey, we're all in high school. And I know this is ridiculous, but let's have a laugh with it." And you talked about those jazz influences. They're not afraid. And it shows how confident the band were to stop doing something and then do doo-wop or, or something like that, or jazz-like chords, which you were not getting because obviously following Van Halen, we then get the, Iron Maiden, Def Leppard, etc. They're Maiden are serious. You don't get a lot of laughs with Maiden, do you? Let's face it. But Van Halen were good time, good musicians, and they did some other albums. Otherwise, I'll talk about Van Halen 1 and Van Halen 2 all day. So tell me a bit about because they were massive, and as it said in the wedding planner, don't wear the T-shirt, you'll hex the band. And who would have thought it after 1980, in the middle of the late 1980s, or just at the beginning of the 80s, they went kapoom in spectacular fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there'd been a bit of a kind of battle for creative control of the band between Eddie and Dave Lee Roth for some time. I mean, two massive egos, the two people with very different kind of approaches. And I think by 1984, Eddie was maybe ready to go in a bit more of a serious direction, wanted to get more into sort of music for music's sake, Dave wanted to go more towards the sort of all-around entertainer style thing, as you see with his first EP with things like Just a Gigolo and California Girls on there. And I think that the tension was just too great. They've been winding each other up for a long time. And so then you get Dave going on a solo career and Sammy Hagar entering.
Yeah.
Courtesy of a tip-off from, I think, Claudio Zampoli, Eddie's Ferrari dealer.
So what was Sammy Hagar doing? Because he'd been in bands before, hadn't he? He wasn't just plucked out of the scene. He was quite well known as a singer. I'm just trying to remember which bands. Did he have his own bands? Was it like the Sammy Hagar band?
He'd been doing solo stuff quite successfully for a few years, but before that, he was the lead singer in Montrose for their first couple of albums. And I think Montrose had been an early influence on Van Halen, also produced by Ted Templeman, who produced all those great early Van Halen albums. So you can kind of hear the sort of sonic template of what he did with Van Halen on that first Montrose record. But yeah, as soon as Hagar enters, a bit of that fun, the kind of knockabout kind of fun and that unpredictability goes out the window. So they're a bit of a different band from that point on.
Yeah, but you see, the thing is, by that point, I mean, Van Halen are huge, aren't they? They're not doing ballrooms. They're doing stadia. They're doing absolutely, huge, football pitches, baseball fields, filling Wembley, etc. So the whole animal has changed, and they changed as well. I mean, there are quite a few, as you said. Eddie always had a smile on his face, even though he had some dark problems, we should say.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think like Hagar retells sort of the story of the first time he met the band. He came down to Eddie's home studio to find that they'd all literally been up all night drinking. So that was his first introduction to them, just like this gang of rolling drunk people. But they immediately started writing, and it carried on being successful. I mean, people loved it. There was. And I think the direction that was taken, maybe with things like Jump and I'll Wait on that last Roth album, that you get a lot more of that, the kind of synth-led, kind of radio-friendly stuff.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? Because Jump, which had got played to death by MTV comes into the scene, makes a huge difference as well. Dave in his spandex or whatever is jumping trout. But it is the first time that a heavy rock band kind of goes mainstream, if you like, or becomes poppy, hits the charts. And that lays a template for your Def Leppard, your White Snake, to make that transition over to the more commercial charts.
Absolutely, yeah. Just sort of capturing that kind of MTV heavy rotation. That was definitely key. And although I know some kind of hardcore fans are a little bit dismissive of Jump, like keyboards, but it's still got that massive Eddie solo in it. And I probably had spells of being snobby about it myself, but it's just a tremendous record. It's pure joy. It's so uplifting. Great solo, amazing Dave Lee Roth vocal. And yeah, it's so important.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's the reason that there were so many imitators after that, because everybody, like I said, from Def Leppard to Whitesnake to whoever, thought, right, we'll try and do Jump and we'll make something. And even if you put your girlfriend on the front of a car spinning around seductively, so it wouldn't have the same effect. And of course, Eddie also goes off and does Michael Jackson, which is complete anathema. I mean, who would have thought that, a heavy rock guitarist would be playing on the King of Pop's, on Beat It, for goodness sake.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that definitely also, I think, helped Michael Jackson to cross over into that rock market, and probably allowed MTV, who were quite wary of sort of anything that seemed R&B early on, I think probably encouraged them to kind of get more behind that album, turn it into the monster that it was. And definitely will also have turned lots of people on to Van Halen, myself included. I mean, that was the first time I ever heard Eddie Van Halen playing when I was a kid. And those pre-internet days took me a little while to kind of find out who he was and that he was in a band. before I finally went and got my first tape. So my first Van Halen album was actually OUA12, the second Hagar album. You know, work my way backwards.
Yeah, that's a cool. Well, yeah. So we're coming up from opposite ends of the scale, and it's interesting because they kept going, and let's face it, then grunge hits. And you're talking about how Southern California and Van Halen couldn't come out anywhere but Southern California. And if you think about it, Soundgarden, Nirvana couldn't come out of anywhere other than Seattle, could it? Because it's that dark, brooding type of music.
Absolutely reflects the climate, doesn't it? Yeah, the brooding kind of windswept, rainy kind. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think Van Halen, like everyone else, was kind of, they really had the rug pulled out from under them by that whole thing, didn't they?
Yeah, but if you think about it, because if you look at, I mean, I will keep raving about Van Halen, but if you look at the original artwork, the record label were trying to make him like the Californian version of The Clash. If you look at the original artwork, which got rejected by the band, and the classic artwork is now them doing what they do best, for individual pictures. So Van Halen they had punk influences, and grunge is absolutely punk influence.
Yeah, I mean, the strange thing is really a lot of those grunge bands will have just grown up listening to Van Halen. I think, for instance, Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins has certainly been really vocal in his fondness for Van Halen, but loads of them must have done. And I think a lot of those bands, if they just, Van Halen included, if they just stuck to doing what they did best, they would have probably ridden out the whole grunge thing a lot better than if they tried to move with the times and kind of reflect it more in a way.
Yeah,
it's hard to speculate, I know, but
I suppose you're trying to stay relevant because you have been at the top of your game. You're still not. You're over them, and they're only in their 40s at this point because they were incredibly young when they broke through. Yeah, so they're trying to prove that they're in the game, and that's always a bit of a move, and it's not always a good one. Problems come onto the band, but there is a resurgence. I mean, they get back together. They do a tour.
Yeah, absolutely. After sort of the sort of unpleasant end of the Sammy Hagar era, and then a bit of a false start with Gary Sharon of Extreme. The resurgence with Dave Lee Roth back in the fold, and Eddie's young son Wolfgang on bass, who's a spectacular musician as well. Yeah, it should be said. And then those live shows. Spectacular. And then I think Wolf, as well as being a great musician, I mean, I missed Michael Anthony because he was also an excellent bass player, and his backing vocals, I think, were a really vital part of their sound. But Wolf did a great job of taking his place. And then I think it was also a real catalyst for them starting to record again, because I think after a couple of missteps, Eddie was quite reluctant to get back to recording, but Wolf was really pressing for that. Yeah.
I mean, it's maybe that Wolf actually understands what, and it's strange because there's the whole debate about Nepo babies, isn't it, at the moment, about people. But he gets the legacy of Van Halen, and he gets what it means to people. And you see him playing with Dave Grohl and playing in the Taylor Hawkins tribute concerts and stuff like that, and doing an outstanding musician. So rather than coming along and going, "Hi, I'm a son of," and just put me in the band and I'll play rhythm, he knows what it means to people in a way that you think a rock star's kid probably doesn't, because they don't tend to do an awful lot, do they?
No, that's very true. But no, he's really. As you say, really did seem to understand what that legacy meant to people. And I think as a result, I think it was probably his idea to sort of make a new record based on, because that last studio album is based a lot on early demos, which they then rewrote and turned into new songs. And so it's a proper link to right back to their earliest days, but with this kind of modern sounding band as well.
So why the book? Why did you decide the time was right to? Because I know you've written about The Damned before, and
yes,
there's a bit of a leap, isn't there? I mean, I suppose they're great showmen actually and they're both called Dave. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like in terms of The Damned, what I mainly am involved in, I play music myself, and I play in punk bands. I'm mostly involved in punk rock. My love of Van Halen kind of predates getting into punk rock. That was kind of, Van Halen was the first band that really got me into music at all.
Right.
And I like the On Track series. I like the format of it. If you've never seen one of these books, it basically is just sort of an in-depth kind of chronological trip through an artist's back catalogue, just looking like at every song. So you get commentary and analysis on songs that have never been written about, that people, forget about. You look at the albums that people have maybe forgotten, that have been swept under the rug a bit. So I always liked that format. I think I got into it because I read the one on Fairport Convention by Kevin Furbank, which is really good. So I did the Damned one, and then, I was just thought, I really enjoyed the process of writing the book. And I had a couple of ideas of other people I'd like to write about. I noticed there wasn't a Van Halen one in the series. They'd been on my mind because obviously Eddie had recently passed away.
Sure.
So I'd been listening to them a lot again. And I just got to thinking that, there are a lot of books about Van Halen, but most of them do tend to kind of focus on a lot of the kind of rock star behavior. You can read in a million places about them smashing hotel rooms, how much they drank here, what they did here. Yeah. There's not that much that goes really into depth about the music. And I thought, I'd love to do that because I enjoy reading nerdy stuff like that. And I figured there must be other people who do too. And
also to go back and listen to all the tracks, because there is, and again, ask your parents, but on the vinyls, there's always, a side B track too. You're like, okay, well, we'll stick that there. But their father was a band leader. I mean, wasn't he? I mean, Van Halen Sr. was a big Dutch band leader. I mean, not physically big, but he was, and they moved over. So, they had the musical chops, didn't they?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, they were definitely brought up with music all around them. Their dad playing saxophone and clarinet, and I think he kind of recruited them to accompany him as soon as they were able to do that. And their mum also encouraged them to be concert pianists because she liked the social status that went with that, I think. So arrived from Amsterdam into America, bringing just sort of one suitcase and a piano, I believe. I
just imagine that. So basically, sort of heavy rock's gain was concert pianist's loss, because imagine the jamming Van Halen brothers, at the Berlin Philharmonic. That would be used for quite something. What do you hope that people rediscover Van Halen? I mean, everybody knows Jump, and everybody knows sort of a couple of bits and pieces, but there is so much more. And and Eddie was a genius, and I put him alongside Jimmy, alongside Stevie Ray Vaughan, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's an absolutely epochal kind of talent. He did the sort of a whole generation of music pivots around him, and around the band as well. I think, if anyone who has just heard a couple of tracks and is a bit curious, if they pick up the book, and it might just guide them to some other bits that they might like. That would be fantastic. Anything I can do to prod people in that direction. I've already seen a couple of my punk mates have, hearing that I've written a book about this, have dug out their old records and got interested again, which is nice to see. So.
Well, I had a next door neighbor in Spain, over here in Spain, and he was a British guy who'd married a Venezuelan girl, and he said the best concert that he ever saw was 1982 Van Halen in Caracas. Can you imagine the chaos?
One can only imagine. It must have been quite a scene. Yes. But wow.
If people want to find out more about you and about the book, I know you're on social media because I've just started stalking you. So where can they find you?
So I am on Instagram. My girlfriend tells me I should get a proper adult Instagram name, but I'm on there as Geek from the Past.
Like it.
That's probably where I'm most active. I do have a Twitter as well, which is @Morgopolo. Again, another really daft social handle. So, yeah, if anyone wants to look me up on either of those, I'll probably keep posting nerdy stuff about Van Halen.
Well, you can keep posting nerdy stuff about Van Halen until the proverbials come home. The book is part of the On Track series. It's Van Halen, every album, every song. It's by Morgan Brown. Morgan, in case you hadn't gathered, I've really enjoyed doing this interview today.
Oh, no, I've really enjoyed it too. Thanks so much for having me on.
Morgan Brown, thank you so much for your time today.